This is Christopher Young, and this is season 1 of my podcast called Gotham and the Sacred. We live in a strange moment. By almost every measure, belief in God remains widespread. Churches still stand, sacred language still circulates, moral claims are made constantly, and yet something has collapsed. Not belief, but authority. Not faith, but function. This is Gotham and the Sacred. This is a podcast about philosophy, theology, ethics, and government, and about what happens when the sacred survives only as sentiment, but no longer orders our lives, restrains our power, or binds us one to another. This season, we explore a condition we call functional fatality. A world in which God is still spoken of, but no longer obeyed. God is invoked, but not feared. Consumed, but not authoritative. We will ask uncomfortable questions. Can democracy survive without moral limits it did not create? Does capitalism depend on virtues it quietly erodes? Why do institutions fail when belief remains strong? And what replaces the sacred when it no longer binds? This is not a podcast about nostalgia or history. It is not a cultural war, and it is not easy answers. It is a serious conversation for a serious age. Welcome to Gotham and the Sacred. Episode 1. The Apocalyptic Frame. We live in an age obsessed with endings. The end of democracy, the end of truth, the end of capitalism, end of the West, end of meaning. Every generation believes it stands at the edge of catastrophe. But ours feels different for one unsettling reason. We cannot agree on what is ending. Only that something is wrong. The language of apocalypse has returned, not primarily as theology or philosophy, but as atmosphere, a pressure in the air, a sense that our institutions are now hollow, that our moral vocabulary is exhausted, that the old rules no longer apply, yet no new ones command obedience. And this mood is not imaginary. It is indeed measurable. In 2022 and 2023, the United States recorded the highest suicide rates in its history. Over 49,000 deaths annually. Among teachers and teenagers, nearly 1 in 5 report experiencing a major depressive episode each year. Anxiety disorders among adolescents have nearly doubled over the past decade. Emergency room visits for self-harm, primarily among teenage girls, surged more than 50% in recent years. At the same time, violent crime, especially homicide, spiked in 2020 at the fastest rate in modern American history. Though numbers fluctuate, the public sense of insecurity remains. And then there is fragmentation. Only about 1/3 of Americans say that most people can be trusted. A steep decline from the early 1970s. Roughly 80% of Americans now say the country is deeply divided on its most important values. Nearly 90% believe political polarization is a serious threat to the nation's future. Trust in the federal government hovers near historic lows, often below 25%. Saying they trust it to do what is right for most of the time. Confidence in media, universities, corporations, and even churches has eroded across the decades. Younger Americans report some of the lowest levels of institutional trust in the developed world. More than half of American adults report feeling lonely or emotionally disconnected. We are not paralyzed. We are fragmented. This episode begins with a simple question. What kind of crisis are we actually in the United States? Is this merely political disagreement, economic stress, technological disruption? Or are these symptoms of something deeper, something structural? To answer this question, we need to step back from the headlines and return to first principles. Apocalypse is not about the end. The word apocalypse does not mean destruction. It means unveiling. An apocalypse reveals what has long been true, but hidden beneath prosperity or distraction. In that sense, we are not living through sudden collapse in the United States, but through exposure. Illusions are failing faster than institutions can adapt. What is being revealed today is not simply corruption or incompetence. It is something substantially more destabilizing than that. Our moral order no longer commands authority. Of course, rules exist, elections still occur, and courts still function. But make no mistake, our obligation has weakened. We comply when it's convenient. We dissent when it's costly. And increasingly, we no longer agree on why anyone should obey at all. Yet this crisis is not lawlessness. It is the erosion of shared moral justification. I will say that again. It is the erosion of shared moral justification. For most of human history, societies did not rely primarily on enforcement to maintain order. They relied on the sacred. The sacred did three things modern systems struggle to do today. The sacred bounded power. Rulers were accountable to something beyond themselves. Second, the sacred unified moral meaning. Of course, disagreement existed, but there was a shared horizon of what ultimately mattered. Third, the sacred made sacrifice intelligible, understandable. So why restrain desire? Why accept limits? Why suffer injustice without immediate retaliation? The sacred would suggest we do it because something higher demanded it. The sacred governed the interior life in a way law never could. Modern societies tell us a different story. Modern societies tell us we can have freedom without obligation, choice without cost, rights without transcendence. For the first time, this seemed sufficient. However, the erosion of sacred authority did not immediately produce chaos. It coincided with economic growth, with expanding rights, with rising living standards, and extraordinary technological advancement. However, we know that prosperity masks fragility. When institutions deliver material comfort, legitimacy feels unnecessary. When life is stable, moral disagreement feels manageable. But prosperity cannot create meaning. It can only delay the consequence of its absence. And then the crisis comes. A pandemic isolates millions. Churches close. Schools close. Virtual life pauses. And then homicide spikes. Riots erupt across major cities. Public discourse becomes moral warfare. and we discover something so unsettling. We come to discover that we lack a shared language for sacrifice. We lack a moral language of agreement. Many assume the problem is that belief has declined. But belief has not vanished. Millions still identify as religious. Religious language remains common in public life. However, what has declined is binding authority. God is invoked but rarely feared in the classic sense. God is quoted, but quoted selectively. God is affirmed, but subordinated to personal preference. Belief has become expressive rather than governing. This is not the dramatic death of God as proclaimed by so many philosophers. It is something much quieter and perhaps more destabilizing. The sacred lingers in the midst symbolically, but no longer binds behavior when it's inconvenient. We call this condition functional fatality, a state in which the sacred remains visible but structurally powerless to us. God indeed exists, but does not regulate power. Morality exists, but it is negotiable. Institutions exist, but are contested at their foundation. In this condition, morality becomes personalized. Authority becomes tribal. Institutions fracture. Extremism finds oxygen to live and prosper. And fragmentation accelerates. When only 1/3 of citizens trust one another, when 80% believe the nation is deeply divided, when more than 90% view polarization as a national threat, the issue is no longer disagreement. It is the breakdown of shared moral imagination. On to Gotham. Gotham is not a city. It is a metaphor for modern power. Gotham is the metaphor for law, markets, bureaucracy, administration, and politics without transcendence. Gotham functions through rules and incentives. But when shared meaning evaporates, procedures alone cannot sustain cohesion. When rules replace virtues, when process replaces judgment, when power answers only to itself, order becomes brittle. Not because people are uniquely wicked, but because nothing binds them beyond self-interest and faction. And when faction replaces covenant, fragmentation becomes permanent. What this season on the Gotham and Sacred will do. This season is not about nostalgia, and it's not a history lesson. We are not proposing theocracy. We are not offering partisan prescriptions. We are asking a deeper question. The question for the entire season is this: what kind of moral authority is necessary for American society to survive? And what happens when it dissolves? We will examine philosophy, theology, sociology, economics, and political theory. We will explore thinkers, many, by the way, who are atheists, who warn that modern freedom without a moral binding sacred will eventually fracture and social disorder will take over the process. We will look at philosophers such as Nietzsche, and we'll look at other philosophers such as Aristotle, all of whom have said the same thing. They warn that modern freedom without a moral binding sacred will eventually collapse. And we'll ask whether renewal requires recovery, not of political control, but of shared transcendence. And the final warning as it relates to this season. Apocalyptic language tempts us towards despair. But apocalypse means unveiling. If something has died in the United States, we must name it honestly. If something can be recovered, we must say it with what it costs. We are not merely living through polarization. We are living through fragmentation. A civilization that still believes, but we're a civilization that no longer obeys. We still speak of morality, but no longer share its source. That still demands rights, but struggles to justify restraint. This podcast exists to speak carefully, seriously, and without illusion about a society confronting functional fatality. Welcome to Gotham and the Sacred.